This is a stamen. This is the anther and filament. When the anther matures and dehydrates, the pollen grains are released spontaneously by rupture of the anther, which is called dehiscence. The pollens are released from the anther along the line of dehiscence. Now the pollens are carried by different agents of pollination: air, water, insects, and the pollens land on the surface of stigma. This is the female reproductive part, pistil or carpel, stigma, style, ovary. The pollens land on the surface of the stigma. The pollens will germinate and they will be responsible for fertilization of the ovule, which is inside the ovary. Now, in over 60% of flowering plants, the pollens are released from mature anther in two-celled stage. That means in above 60% of angiosperms, when pollens are released, each pollen has two cells inside it, vegetative cell and generative cell. At the time of dehiscence, at the time of release, the pollens are two-celled. Each pollen grain contains a large vegetative cell and the smaller generative cell. When they land on the stigma, then the generative cell divides by mitosis, forming two male gametes, and the pollens become three-celled. But the pollens are shed at two-celled stage in above 60% of angiosperms. In the rest of the flowering species, the pollens are released at three-celled stage. That means the generative cell inside the pollen grain divides mitotically to form two male gametes before the pollens are released. When the pollens are still inside the microsporangia or pollen sacs, the generative cell divides to form male gametes. The pollens are already three-celled before they are shed. So in the rest 40% flowering plants, the pollens are released in three-celled stage. The pollen grains represent male gametophyte in all flowering plants. Please remember, this is a very important point. The pollen grains represent male gametophyte in the flowering plants. Now, what are the harmful effects and what are the useful effects? You can make one table. The harmful effects are the pollen grains cause respiratory diseases like bronchitis, asthma, etc. Pollen grains of certain species cause pollen allergy when they are consumed through the nasal passages when they are inhaled incidentally by any human. For example, pollen grains of Parthenium or carrot grass cause pollen allergy. Parthenium or carrot grass is a foreign species, exotic species. It does not belong to our native land. It was introduced to India as a contaminant along with imported wheat. And at the beginning, the Parthenium was not recognized, but later on it was found it is a unwanted plant because Parthenium or carrot grass has a very high rate of growth. It has become ubiquitous. It grows everywhere. It is a weed. The pollens of Parthenium cause pollen allergy. Pollens have some useful effects too. Pollens are rich sources of nutrients. Pollen tablets are consumed nowadays as food supplements. In Western countries, the pollen products are available in the form of tablets and syrups in the markets. It has been found that consumption of pollens or pollen tablets increases the performance of sports personalities, that means the athletes and the race horses. Now, viability. Viability of pollen grains. Viability means ability of the pollen grains to remain functional. Ability of the pollen grains to remain potential to fertilize the ovules. How long pollens remain viable? When the pollens are released from anther and land on the stigma till the time of fertilization, the pollens must remain viable. The pollens are released and land on the stigma. If the pollens lose viability, they are no longer capable of fertilizing the ovules inside the ovary. The viability is dependent on different factors of the environment like humidity and the temperature of the external environment. So before the pollens become non-functional, before the pollens become non-viable, they must land on the stigma. Before they lose viability, all the pollens must land on the surface of stigma. Now the period of viability varies from species to species. In cereals, rice, wheat, maize, the pollens remain viable for 30 minutes. Within half an hour, they lose viability. In three families, Rosaceae, Leguminosae and Solanaceae, the pollens remain viable for several months. Rosaceae, example rose. Solanaceae, brinjal, potatoes, tomatoes, datura, chilies. Leguminosae, legumes, peas, beans, etc. This is about viability of the pollen grains. Now storage. Pollens can be stored for a long time in liquid nitrogen minus 196 degree Celsius. These pollens represent pollen bank, and these pollens which are preserved, which are stored in liquid nitrogen, can be used in future for crop breeding programs.